Translation studies in 21st century. Linguistics and translation. Up to 1960s, translation was seen as a subfield of linguistics on the basic premise that it involved a transaction between two languages. J.C. Catford's A Linguistic Theory of Translation, 1965, underpins this assumption and defines translation as comprising of a substitution of TL meanings for SL meanings. In fact, translation was predicated upon some kind of equivalence, and it was said to be obtained either at the level of rank, word, phrase, sentence, text, or on the type of the meaning, denotative, connotative, pragmatic, which was assumed to reside somewhere outside the language and held to be constant in translation. The idea of the possibility of interlingual synonymy has dominated this type of theory. However, a literary artist exploits the sensuous phonic aspect of words in order to accomplish extra-linguistic semantic purpose, that is, the feel of the language, that is, rhythms and cadence in the very curl of the word or the echo around words, the tonality and pitch. Thus, even intralingual synonymy is far from possible, let alone the interlingual one. In 1970s, there was a growing realization that literary texts were constituted not of language but of culture, language being just a vehicle of culture. Not only were the words like roti, choli, kurta, dharma, karma or maya culture specific, but the whole language was specific to the culture. This view is reinforced by Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which says, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis seems to support the view that our thinking is determined by language, linguistic determinism, and that people who speak different languages perceive and think about the world quite differently, linguistic relativity. Thus, meaning does not reside in a text but arises in its interpretation, which is influenced by socio-cultural contexts. This whole new awareness, thus, meaning does not reside in a text but arises in its interpretation, which is influenced by socio-cultural contexts. This whole new awareness brought about what is popularly called the cultural turn in translation studies. Comparative literature and translation studies. Translation's independence from linguistic coincidentally synchronized with his devouring of the field of comparative literature, which had a seminal influence of intercultural literary studies of all kinds for more than a century. Susan Bassnett, in her book Comparative Literature, 1993, declared that today comparative literature in one sense is dead. She in turn held two newly born disciplines responsible for this casualty. Post-colonial studies, which stole much of comparative literature's thematurgical concerns. Translation studies, which encroached upon comparative literature's methodological concerns. In this regard, Professor Harish Trivedi puts forth a very witty remark. Increasingly now, comparative studies of literatures across languages have become the concern of translation studies. It is the translation tail now that wags the comparative dog. Trivedi, 2010. However, one has to be cautious of the dangers of blindly applying Western notions and understanding to densely pluralistic Indian society. In multilingual and multicultural Indian society, comparative literature is not as yet a spent force, something which has been underscored by A.K. Ramanujan, who, through his translations of classical Tamil poetry and folk tales, recovered neglected narratives of the masses. Indian literature cannot be conceived in terms of monolithic singular category because, as Sisir Kumar Das says, Indian literature is an internally constructed literary universe accommodating the diversities of experience and expression of Indian people. The responsibility of the comparatist is to evolve indigenous categories that would enable better understanding of literature written in regional languages, quoted in Location of Indian Literature. The task of comparative literature in India is not to construct a sanitized homogeneity achieved by silencing internal differences and enriching diversity. A comparatist should complicate his attitudes and perceptions of regional literatures and evolve discourse that can bring out their political subtext of caste, gender, region and religion. E.V. Ramakrishnan, 2011. One needs to realize that translations of regional literature in English cannot be the sole basis of study of comparative Indian literature, since what gets lost in translation has to be supplemented by comparative literature with the help of critical explications combining the insights from literary theory and social sciences. Cultural studies and translation studies. In 1990s, the already in ascendance field of translation studies witnessed a mammoth rise of a new discipline which threatened to devour it. And it was the all-powerful, all-encompassing field of cultural studies that applied many different approaches, methods, and academic perspectives to uncover the political dynamics of contemporary culture and its historical foundations, conflicts, and defining traits. In 1998, Susan Bassnett and André Lefebvre envisioned a collaboration and interaction between these two interdisciplines to enable a transcendence of Eurocentric theoretical boundaries by bringing about what they called the translation turn in cultural studies. These two enthusiastic theoreticians laid out a 4-point agenda for both these domains, including an investigation of the way in which different cultures construct their images of writers and texts, a tracking of the ways in which text becomes cultural capital across cultural boundaries, and an exploration of the politics of translation. Trivedi, 2002. The fourth point underlines the commonality of concerns and pleaded for an intensified collaboration in these multifaceted interdisciplines. Isolation is counterproductive. The study of translation, like the study of culture, needs a plurality of voices, and similarly, the study of culture always involves an examination of processes of encoding and decoding that comprise translation. Constructing Cultures, page 138 to 139. However, no such alliance has come out between these promising interdisciplines, probably because, as Harish Trivedi points out, cultural studies, even when concerned with popular or subaltern culture, nearly always operate in just the one language, English, and often in that high and abstruse variety of it called theory, while translation studies, however theoretical they may get from time to time, but solely their hands in at least two languages, only one of which can be English. Harish Trivedi, 2002. Multiculturalism and translation studies. Of late, multiculturalism has attempted to tie theoretical knot with translation studies through characteristic use of the phrase cultural translation. Cultural translation draws its sustenance from post-colonial and post-modernist discourse spelled out by Homi Bhabha in The Location Culture, 1994. Bhabha looks upon the term translation as involving transformation of identity and hybrid selfhood entailing migration of individuals. He propounds his concept by giving the example of Salman Rushdie, who famously proclaimed himself a translated man. In simple terms, cultural translation is defined by Bhabha as a process and condition of human migrancy. Trivedi, 2002. Especially migration of individuals from third world to the first world. Through the example of Hanif Qureshi, Professor Harish Trivedi betrays that Baba actually misconceives and misrepresents cultural translation as the need of migrant. As a matter of fact, it is the requirement of the society and culture to which the migrant has travelled. It is hegemonic Western demand and necessity. The West's complacency and apathy in translating the non-West culture and identity has been testified in writings of Jhumpa Lahiri and Salman Rushdie, who mistranslate and semi-represent Indian realities in Western frame and language for self-aggrandizement and vested interest. If such a parochial understanding of culture of the other is to form the bedrock of the theory of multiculturalism, it might not be able to forge any meaningful ties with translation studies in foreseeable future. The subaltern can speak eloquently, not in English of course, but in his mother tongue, and unless and until the first world academia and society decides to hear his or her oratory in his or her own terms and language, the postmodernist project of multiculturalism will remain hollow and meaningless from within.